Welcome to Weekly News Highlights, where we wrap up your week with a glimpse back into what went on over the past week. I'm Peunji in Seoul, filling in for Kim Da-mi. Speaking following last week's general election, President Yoon Suk Yeol has said he will carefully listen to the public. As for a meeting with the opposition leader Lee Jae-myung, a senior official has hinted that it's possible but would take time. Iran's historic attack on Israel has raised fears of a wider conflict in the Middle East. South Korea is monitoring signs of a possible connection with North Korea, and experts say stronger ties between North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China is expected to become a threat to the international community. U.S. Fed Chair Jerome Powell says the country's economy has not seen inflation come back to the central bank's goal, hinting that interest rate cuts will likely come later than expected. President Yoon Suk Yeol delivered a speech on the outcome of the April 10th election, saying that he'll carefully listen to the people as he expressed his regret over the result. The South Korean leader elaborated on how his administration would proceed over the next 3 years on its key policies. Our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young reports.
President Yoon Suk Yeol has apologized for his failure to communicate and reflect the needs of Korean citizens, humbly accepting their choice to vote in an opposition majority into parliament. This came at Tuesday's cabinet meeting, where the South Korean leader conveyed his position on the outcome of last week's general election, which saw a crushing defeat for Yoon's ruling People Power Party, casting a shadow over the next 3 years of his presidency. Yoon said he had focused on making systematic improvements to the Korean economy, but in the grand scheme of things, the administration had failed to deliver tangible improvements to people's livelihoods.
결국 아무리 국정의 방향이 옳고 좋은 정책을 수없이 추진한다 해도 국민들께서 실제 변화를 느끼지 못한다면 정부의 역할을 다하지 못한 것입니다. 국민께서 바라시는 변화가 무엇인지, 어떤 것이 국민과 나라를 위한 길인지 더 깊이 고민하고 살피겠습니다.
To this end, Yoon plans to continue a series of policy forums around the nation, which invite local citizens to discuss issues affecting their livelihoods. Yoon also vowed to move ahead with his 3 major reforms for education, labour and pensions to overcome fundamental barriers to future economic growth, as well as push for medical reform. More crucially, the president pledged to become more humble and flexible in his communication and listen carefully to the voices of the people in recognition of their diverse needs. A senior aide to Yoon added that the president, in his closing remarks, said he was sorry for failing to reflect upon public opinion and that he had been the first to fail to communicate. Yoon's office has been seen as lacking in public engagement and uncompromising in pushing through policies without sufficient discourse. Also leading up to the election, the controversy surrounding Yoon's Secretary for Social Affairs and his ambassador to Australia had further dampened public opinion. With Yoon having promised a reform of how his administration runs state affairs, the president is expected to replace his most senior officials, including his chief of staff and the prime minister, who offered to resign last Thursday. Yoon's aide told reporters that given the enormity of these positions, the new appointments will take time, indicating this week may be too soon. A structural reform of his office is also expected in order to become more communicative and reflective of public opinion and work with the opposition in parliament. Regarding the possibility of the president meeting opposition leader Lee Jae-myung, the official indicated that all possibilities are open for communication with the opposition. However, as the ruling party's leadership has not been consolidated, the meeting would take at least the minimum amount of time for both sides to make it happen. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Japan has once again renewed its false territorial claims to Korea's easternmost Dokdo Island in its diplomatic paper, sparking a strong backlash from Seoul. The report also reiterated that it would not accept South Korea's ruling, ordering Japanese firms to compensate Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. Our Chae Min-jung has the details.
Japan has yet again made territorial claims over Dokdo Island in its annual foreign policy report. In its 2024 diplomatic blue book released on Tuesday, Tokyo renewed its false claim that Dokdo is Japanese territory and stated that Seoul continued its illegal occupation of Dokdo. It's a claim that has been repeatedly made in Japan's diplomatic blue book since 2018. South Korea responded with a strong protest against what it called Japan's repeated unfair territorial claims. The Foreign Ministry called for an immediate withdrawal of the claim.
There is no territorial dispute over Dokdo, as it is clearly our territory historically, geographically, and under international law. Our government exercises firm territorial sovereignty over Dokdo, and we will respond firmly and strictly to any unjust claims regarding Dokdo.
The ministry also summoned the deputy chief of mission at the Japanese embassy in Seoul. The Blue Book also disputed a South Korean Supreme Court ruling which ordered Japanese firms to compensate South Korean victims of wartime forced labor during Japan's colonial rule. Despite repeated requests over the years, Japan has refused to make reparations to individuals, insisting all matters were settled under the 1965 treaty that normalized bilateral ties. In an attempt to mend relations with Japan, Seoul last year implemented plans to settle the issue of compensation through funds procured through a third party.
We hope Japan will continue to make efforts to develop a future-oriented bilateral relationship while inheriting the historical awareness of Japan's past cabinets. Our government will continue to make efforts to help victims recover through the compensation plan.
Meanwhile, the Blue Book describes South Korea as an important neighboring country that Japan should cooperate with as a partner. This reflects a significant improvement in bilateral ties since President Yoon Suk Yeol took office in 2022, as Tokyo last called Seoul a partner 14 years ago. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Iran's unprecedented retaliatory attack on Israel last weekend is fueling fears of a wider war in the Middle East. For more on this, we have our Choi Min-jung in the studio. Welcome back, Min-jung.
Thank you for having me.
So, Min-jung, the crisis in the Middle East has worsened this week with Iran's attack on Israel. What's the story?
Right, last Saturday, Iran launched its largest ever drone strike using hundreds of drones and missiles to target Israel. It was the first time Iran directly attacked Israeli territory. The strike was a response to the deadly bombing of Iran's embassy compound in Syria on April 1st, which killed 7 members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Israeli military confirmed that there were more than 300 drones and missiles launched, but claimed its air defense systems and its allies were able to intercept most of the threats.
We intercepted 99% of the threats launched towards Israel's territory. This is a very significant strategic achievement.
And the attack has sparked concerns from the international community, with world leaders calling for restraint.
Right, global leaders are responding with urgency in a bid to ease escalating tensions. South Korea strongly condemned Iran's moves, with President Yoon Suk Yeol convening an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. U.S. President Joe Biden said that Washington would not participate in any counteroffensive launched against Iran, but instead would only continue to assist defending Israel. Leaders of the group of 7 nations convened a meeting and unanimously condemned Iran's attack. And an emergency meeting at the UN headquarters also took place upon the urgent request of Israel. There, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for a de-escalation of violence and maximum restraint.
The Middle East is on the brink. It's time to step back from the brink. It's vital to avoid any action that could lead to major military confrontations on multiple fronts in the Middle East.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Treasury Department has warned of new economic sanctions against Iran, while EU leaders also decided to step up sanctions.
We have decided to put in place sanctions against Iran. This is a clear signal that we want to send.
Right, Min-jung, we can definitely see that fears are mounting over a possible escalation of war in the Middle East. And I hear there are also growing concerns of a possible cooperation between North Korea and Iran.
Right. Pyongyang and Tehran are known to have had close ties over the past few decades, with both facing international sanctions for their weapons programs. Following the attack, the U.S. said it is incredibly concerned about Pyongyang and Tehran's long-suspected military cooperation, and a Pentagon press secretary also expressed concerns over the possibility that North Korean weapons were used in Saturday's attack on Israel. South Korea's National Intelligence Service is closely monitoring whether or not this is the case. The U.S. ambassador to the UN also addressed the speculation during her visit to South Korea this week.
We are concerned about the Iranians providing weapons to the Russians, and the Russians also supporting efforts to help the DPRK expand their own research into developing weapons, and certainly that would be the case with Iran as well. We have to look for every opportunity to call them out, but also to hold them accountable.
Now, experts are saying that cooperation between North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia are bound to pose a bigger threat to the international community. How so?
Right. North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China are all currently in conflict with the West. The Washington Post this week reported that what we have now is better understood as a marriage of convenience between a number of disparate nations. In other words, these countries are seeking ways to benefit each other amid pressure from the West. The report said sanctions and export controls from the West have pushed Russia to turn to China, allowing China to benefit from Russia's rich natural resources and its military technology in return. Moscow also looked to North Korea to strengthen military cooperation for its war in Ukraine. And as we mentioned before, there is speculation over North Korea's involvement with Iran as well. The Washington Post also implies that the desperation to work together due to isolation from the West could lead to dangerous situations.
Right, Minjung, I guess we'll have to hope the international community can act together as one to prevent a wider conflict in the Middle East. Thank you for the wrap-up.
My pleasure.
On the economic front, U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell has said high inflation figures will likely delay any rate cuts until later this year, signaling a period of higher for longer rates. The central bank has long kept its inflation target at 2%. Reaching the target would mean rate cuts to levels seen before the COVID-19 pandemic.
The recent data have clearly not given us greater confidence and instead indicate that it's likely to take longer than expected to achieve that confidence. That said, we think policy is well positioned to handle the risks that we face. If higher inflation does persist, we can maintain the current level of restriction for as long as needed.
His comments are in contrast to remarks made just 2 weeks ago, when he said overall outlook had not changed much despite some hotter than expected figures at the start of the year, and that central bank officials expected to lower rates at some point this year. Powell's remarks led to a sharp decline in U.S. stocks, and the South Korean won fell against the dollar. The $1 exchange rate briefly hit the 1,400 Korean won mark this week for the first time in 17 months. Top finance officials from South Korea, the United States, and Japan have voiced their deep concerns over the continuing decline of the value of the South Korean won and Japanese yen against the dollar. They committed to ongoing dialogue and cooperation to stabilize the currencies and ensure economic growth. Our Shin Se-byuk reports.
The finance ministers of South Korea, the United States, and Japan have acknowledged serious concerns regarding the rapid decline in the value of the South Korean won and the Japanese yen against the dollar. Following their first trilateral meeting in Washington on Wednesday, South Korea's Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and Japan's Finance Minister Shinichi Suzuki issued a joint statement outlining their commitment to regular consultations on foreign exchange market trends and continued collaboration to promote sustainable economic growth and financial stability. The major concern raised by the three countries focused on the persistent devaluation of the won and yen against the U.S. dollar. The won is currently ranked as the fifth most undervalued currency among OECD countries. According to data released by the Bank for International Settlements on Wednesday, as of February 18th, South Korea's real effective exchange rate stood at 96.7 out of 100, using 2020 as the base year. The REER measures the relative purchasing power of a country's currency compared to other nations. A value above 100 indicates an overvaluation relative to the base year, while below 100 signifies undervaluation. Japan has the lowest index value among the OECD nations at 70.3. This assessment indicates that the strength of the US dollar, coupled with the significant undervaluation of the Japanese currency, directly affects the won. Meanwhile, Bank of Korea Governor Lee Jae-myung acknowledged slight deviation in the won's exchange rate from market fundamentals, but reaffirmed that the authorities are equipped with the necessary tools to stabilize any volatile moves in the national currency. His comments indicating Korea's readiness to intervene in the market to support the won were made during an International Monetary Fund panel session on Wednesday. He is in the U.S. capital for the annual IMF and World Bank meetings, as well as meetings with G20 finance leaders and leading central bankers. 신세벽, Arirang News.
Samsung Electronics is set to receive over $6 billion in subsidies from the Biden administration to advance its chip-making ambitions in the U.S. The pledge comes a week after a similar grant for Taiwan's chip-making giant TSMC. Our Lee Jae-myung has the details.
The U.S. government announced on Monday that it has decided to provide up to $6.4 billion in subsidies under the U.S. CHIPS Act to Samsung Electronics, which is investing in a high-tech semiconductor production facility in Taylor, Texas. In line with the grant announced by Washington, Samsung Electronics will invest $17 billion to expand the size and investment target of the semiconductor manufacturing plant under construction, with a total of approximately $45 billion in investment by 2030. Under the proposed investment in Taylor, the South Korean tech giants will construct a comprehensive advanced manufacturing cluster, including 2 leading-edge logic foundry fabrications, a research and development fab, and an advanced packaging facility. The $6.4 billion in subsidies given to Samsung Electronics is the 3rd largest to date. American semiconductor company Intel is set to receive $8.5 billion, followed by Taiwan's TSMC, which will receive $6.6 billion. $39 billion worth of incentives were put aside under the terms of the U.S. CHIPS Act to encourage chipmakers to build, expand, or improve semiconductor facilities in the U.S., with the Commerce Department looking to invest some $28 billion of the total sum in chipmakers like Samsung Electronics. This comes as the Biden administration has been pushing for initiatives to drive up domestic chip manufacturing amid the U.S.-China rivalry. Investments being made by major chip makers, including Samsung, will put the U.S. on track to deliver on its plan to produce around 20% of the world's leading-edge logic chips by 2030. Lee Jae-myung, Arirang News.
In related news, Samsung Electronics topped the global smartphone market once again in Q1 this year, mainly due to good sales performance in its recently released Galaxy S24 series. According to a market research firm IDC on Monday, the South Korean chipmaker accounted for more than 20% of the total market share, with over 60 million mobile phone shipments in the first quarter. Its rival Apple, which was first placed in Q4 of last year, accounted for some 17% and came in second. Chinese manufacturer Xiaomi ranked 3rd place. The International Monetary Fund has warned South Korea's debt-to-GDP ratio will approach 60% by 2029, having already surpassed 50% in 2021. The analysis comes as the IMF released its fiscal monitor report this week, where it said global debt levels could increase with 2024 being an election year in many countries around the world. Our Lee Jae-myung reports.
The South Korean government's debt-to-gross domestic product ratio already exceeded 50% for the first time in 2021 and is expected to reach close to 60% by 2029. That's according to the International Monetary Fund's Fiscal Monitor report released on Wednesday, which included the debt-to-GDP ratio from 2015 to 2029 in 37 advanced countries, including South Korea, the United States, and Japan. The report says South Korea's debt-to-GDP ratio hit 55.2% in 2023, a 1.4 percentage point increase from the year before. IMF data also shows that the country's debt-to-GDP stood at 40.8% in 2015, but surged from 42.1% in 2019 to 48.7% in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. It reached 51.3% in 2021, exceeding the 50% mark for the first time. The UN agency also estimated that South Korea's debt will reach 56.6% this year and will continue to increase, hitting 59.4% in 2029. The IMF also said that global debt levels are at risk of increasing due to 2024 being an election year. Vitor Gaspar, the head of the International Monetary Fund's fiscal affairs, said that history and empirical evidence show that governments tend to spend more or tax less in an election year. 88 economies or economic areas representing more than half of the world's population have either held or are due to hold elections this year. The IMF forecasts the U.S. fiscal deficit to remain above 6% over the next 5 years, with Gaspar noting the U.S. has ample fiscal space due to measures they can impose on the spending and revenue side. However, like the U.S., Gaspar says China's fiscal deficit is projected to rise from more than 7% of GDP last year to around 8% by 2029. This could have consequences for the global economy, as China is a major lender to developing countries. The Fiscal Monitor report called for countries to make a renewed push towards improving their fiscal positions, especially due to the tight monetary policies in many central banks, which are expected to be loosened later this year. Lee Jae-myung, Arirang News.
It's been 10 years since the tragic sinking of the Sewol ferry that took the lives of so many young people in the country on April 16, 2014. We take a closer look at how the victims are remembered on this day. Our Chair Jerome tells the story.
April 16, 2014. In the west coastal waters of Chindo, Jeollanam-do province in South Korea, the Sewol ferry accident took 304 people's lives. For the past 10 years, the families left behind have remained in deep sorrow, but they have been supporting each other to help overcome their pain. In 2021, the families created the Tanwon High School 4.16 memory classroom to preserve the records and mementos of the dead students. In this empty classroom, the dreams and futures of the 254 Tanwon High School students who made up most of the victims have been frozen for a decade. The government also acknowledged the national responsibility for the Sewol tragedy and recognized the value of the records in this space.
The Korean Ministry of Interior and Safety has added the Tanwon High School 4.16 memorial classroom to the National Archives of Korea in 2021, preserving it as a place of public memory.
Asked the mother of Kim Do-hun, a second-year Class 3 student, one of the victims and the curator of the memory classroom, said there are memoirs that should not be forgotten.
The people of South Korea and everyone around the world vividly witnessed the Sewol tragedy happen on that day. This space is not just for memories of the disaster and the wounds it caused, but also a place for the future where we overcome pain and create hope.
The day remains a deep wound in Koreans' hearts as well.
Although I don't remember it well, I have visited here ever since the Sewol incident happened. I thought that such a thing should never happen again.
The memorial ceremony was held in Ansan, Gyeonggi-do province on Tuesday, home to the Tanwon High School, which most of the victims attended, marking the 10th anniversary. Over 3,000 people attended the ceremony. The names of the 304 victims were called out one by one, including the 5 whose remains have yet to be recovered. At 4:16 p.m., a siren sounded to honor the victims and to remind people to be aware of potential disasters. Painful, but continuing to replay memories, this is how they heal their wounds and mourn their lost children. Chae Jerome, Arirang News, Ansan.
With the rest of the country scrambling to find ways to combat the rising number of vacant homes, a small alleyway in South Korea is seeing its numbers drop. Our business correspondent Lee Soo-jin has the story.
It's a small coffee shop within an alleyway in the central region of South Korea. A buzz of chatter travels through the air, even though it's a weekday, with most of it coming from this coffee shop. At first glance, it seems like your everyday coffee shop, but it was once an abandoned home. Originally built in the 1950s, the house had been left vacant for 13 years before the owner of the coffee shop decided to purchase and transform it into a space that people would find appealing. But he decided to renovate it in a way that would preserve its original form.
There are two types of architectural styles here. On this side, you can see elements of Japanese colonial architecture, and on the other side, modern Korean architecture.
South Korea has seen a surge in vacant homes from its declining population, with over 130,000 reported across the country as of 2022, nearly half of which are in rural areas. Because vacant homes tend to attract crime, there have been various efforts made by local governments to turn these into community assets. The local administration in Chungju, where this coffee shop is located, provides 10 million won, or around $7,000, in renovation grants for those who purchase vacant homes. The owner says these benefits and his own success story have encouraged others to purchase vacant homes, not just in this alleyway, but also in nearby areas.
The home vacancy rate stood at 50% 7 years ago. As of last year, it's at 10 to 12%.
Lee Jae-myung is someone who bought a vacant home on a street 10 minutes away from the coffee shop.
Around 80 to 90% of my decision to purchase a vacant home was influenced by the success of the coffee shop.
He is now the owner of not just his own coffee shop, but also a guest house. Locals say that the atmosphere of the town has changed since these vacant homes were transformed.
Before, these streets felt run down, but now they have come alive again.
She added that she believes the town will continue to flourish as there are other vacant homes currently undergoing renovation. Business owners here say that an ability to see value in the old, as well as more monetary government support, are what will help not just this town but other areas across the nation with high home vacancy rates come alive again. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News, Chungju.
That's all we have for this week. Thank you for watching Weekly News Highlights. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.